It was a frigid December evening in a small town on the outskirts of Montreal, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and makes you question every decision that led you be outside. Jacques Tremblay, a man in his late 50s with a weathered face and a tattered coat, sat on a cardboard sheet in an alley off Rue Saint-Denis. He was homeless, had been for years, and his worldly possessions amounted to a backpack with a broken zipper, a half-empty water bottle, and exactly $8 in crumpled bills tucked into his pocket. Those $8 were all he had left after a day of panhandling, and he was saving them for a hot meal at the diner down the street. But then, a stranger on a motorcycle changed everything. Jacques noticed a motorbike first, a black Harley-Davidson, its chrome glinting under the dim streetlights. The rider, a broad-shouldered man in a leather jacket with a skull patch on the back, pulled up near the alley. His name was Mark, though Jacques didn't know it yet. Mark's bike sputtered, then stalled, and he cursed under his breath as he climbed off to inspect it. Jacques watched quietly from his spot, unnoticed at first. Mark fumbled with the fuel cap, then checked his pockets, his face tightening with frustration. He was out of gas, and his wallet was empty. He glanced around, muttering about being stranded. Jacques, who'd seen countless people passing by without a second glance, felt something stir. Maybe it was the way Mark's shoulders slumped, or maybe it was a memory of a time when Jacques himself had needed help and found none. He stood up, his joints creaking, and shuffled over. Mark barely looked up as Jacques approached, but when the older man held out his trembling hand with those 8 crumpled dollar bills, Mark froze. "Take it," Jacques said, his voice rough from years of smoking and sleeping in the cold. "Get some gas. You need it more than I do." Mark stared at the money, then at Jacques. "You sure, man? That's all you got, ain't it?" Jacques nodded. "It's enough. Go on." Mark hesitated, then took the bills, his gloved fingers brushing Jacques' callous ones. He didn't say much, just a quick "thanks, I owe you," before heading to the gas station across the street. Jacques watched him go, then settled back onto his cardboard, figuring that was the end of it. He didn't expect to see Mark again. He certainly didn't expect what happened next. Word travels fast in certain circles, and Mark wasn't just any biker. He was a member of the Hells Angels, a name that carried weight in the underbelly of Quebec streets. Mark told his crew about the homeless guy who'd given him his last $8 without a second thought. It wasn't just the money. It was a gesture, the kind of thing that cuts through the noise of a world that often feels transactional. The Hells Angels, for all their rough reputation, had a code of their own, and Jacques' act hit a nerve. 2 days later, Jacques was back in his alley, trying to stay warm with a thin blanket he'd found in a dumpster. The sound of engines rumbled in the distance, growing louder until it was deafening. Jacques looked up, confused, as a line of motorcycles, dozens and hundreds, rolled into the narrow street. Leather-clad riders, their bikes adorned with patches and chrome, filled the alley. Jacques' heart raced. He didn't know what was happening, but he'd heard stories about the Hells Angels, and none of them suggested they showed up in droves for a friendly chat. Mark stepped forward, his boots crunching on the gravel. He recognized Jacques immediately and raised a hand to signal the others to stay back. "You the guy from the other night?" Mark asked, though he already knew the answer. Jacques nodded, clutching his blanket tighter. "Yeah, what's this about?" Mark grinned, a rare softness in his eyes. "You helped me out when I was stuck. We don't forget that kind of thing." Before Jacques could respond, another biker, a grizzled man with a gray beard named Claude, stepped up. He was one of the chapter's leaders, and his presence commanded attention. He looked Jacques over, not with judgment, but with something like respect. "You gave up your last $8, Claude said. "Most people wouldn't do that. Not for a stranger, not for one of us." Jacques didn't know what to say. He wasn't used to being seen, let alone praised. "It wasn't nothing," he mumbled. "Just trying to help." Claude shook his head. "It's something, and we're going to make it right." What followed was something Jacques could never have imagined. The bikers, all 300 of them, had come together to repay his kindness in a way that shook the entire town. They'd pooled their money, not just spare change, but thousands of dollars. Claude handed Jacques a thick envelope stuffed with cash, enough to get him off the streets for a while, maybe even for good. But it wasn't just about the money. The Hells Angels had connections, and they'd called in favors. A local shelter agreed to give Jacques a bed for as long as he needed it. A diner owner, who knew some of the bikers, offered him a job washing dishes. No questions asked. Even a small apartment was secured, rented out by a landlord who owed the Angels a favor. Jacques stood there, holding the envelope, his hands shaking not from the cold but from the weight of what was happening. He tried to speak, to thank them, but the words caught in his throat. Mark clapped him on the shoulder. "You're one of us now in a way," he said. "You need something, you find me." The bikers didn't linger long. They mounted their Harleys, the roar of engines filling the alley once more, and rode off into the night, leaving Jacques standing there, clutching the envelope like it was a lifeline. For the first time in years, he felt something he'd almost forgotten: hope. News of the event spread quickly. Locals whispered about the homeless man who'd given his last $8 to a biker, only to have 300 Hells Angels show up at his doorstep. Some called it a miracle, others called it karma. Jacques didn't care for the labels. He moved into the apartment a week later, a small one-bedroom with a view of the street where he used to sleep. The diner job wasn't glamorous, but it was steady, and the owner, a gruff woman named Marie, treated him like family. Jacques kept to himself mostly, but he'd sometimes see Mark riding by, always with a nod or a wave. The envelope of cash was enough to cover rent for a year, and Jacques used it carefully, stretching every dollar. He didn't talk much about what happened, but when he did, it was with a quiet disbelief, like he still couldn't quite wrap his head around it. The story didn't end there, though. Jacques' act of kindness had a ripple effect. People in the town started talking about helping each other more, inspired by the unlikely bond between a homeless man and a group of bikers. The Hells Angels, too, found their reputation softened, at least locally. They were still a force to be reckoned with, but people saw a different side of them, a side that remembered a small act of generosity and turned it into something life-changing. Jacques never forgot that night, the roar of the bikes, the weight of the envelope, the feeling of being seen. He kept the $8 gesture to himself, not because he was ashamed, but because it was his. It was a moment he'd chosen to give when he had nothing, and in return, he'd received more than he could have ever asked for. Over the months that followed, Jacques settled into his new life. The apartment became a home, with a small coffee maker on the counter and a second-hand couch where he'd sit and watch the world go by. He worked hard at the diner, earning enough to start saving a little. Marie, the owner, would sometimes sit with him after closing, sharing a coffee and talking about life. She'd lost her own brother to the streets years ago, and she saw something of him in Jacques. Mark stopped by the diner one day, about 6 months after the night in the alley. He wasn't wearing his leather jacket this time, just a plain hoodie, but Jacques recognized him immediately. They didn't say much, just share a nod and a few words about the weather. But before Mark left, he slid a small patch across the counter, a miniature version of the Hells Angels' winged skull. "Keep it," Mark said. "You earned it." Jacques kept the patch in a drawer, not sure what to do with it, but unwilling to let it go. It wasn't about the angels or their world. It was about what it represented, a moment of connection, of humanity, in a world that often felt cold and indifferent. The town never forgot the story, either. It became a kind of local legend, told and retold in bars and coffee shops, a reminder that even the smallest act can set off a chain reaction. Jacques didn't think of himself as a hero, just a man who'd done what felt right. But to those who knew the story, he was proof that kindness, no matter how small, could move mountains, or at least bring 300 Hells Angels to your doorstep. Years later, Jacques was still at the diner, now helping Marie manage the place. He'd grown a little grayer, a little softer around the edges, but his eyes still carried the weight of his years on the street. He didn't talk about the $8 or the bikers much, but every now and then, when a new customer asked about the patch in the frame above the counter, he'd smile and say, "It's a long story." And if they had the time, he'd tell it, not to boast, but to remind them and himself that even in the darkest moments, there's a chance for something good to come through.